For this chapter, we're going to be covering stem changers in the present and preterite tense. We've already covered reflexive verbs in the present tense. You can actually do them in the present or preterite. When we did cover them, we used these present tense endings, o, asa, amos, an, and o, es, e, hemos, imos, en. But we did some regular reflexive conjugations. We also did some stem changing irregular conjugations. So when we do a stem change, just like when we did with the verb acostarse and despertarse and divertirse, we have to make the extra stem change. So work backwards from the verb, take away the reflexive, and then put your reflexive pronoun that agrees with the subject. Then work with your AR, ER, IR, and put the ending for either present or preterite. In the present tense, it makes an extra stem change. For acostarse, it's an O to UE change inside the boot. Despertarse is the second E, not the first one, that changes inside the boot. In the preterite, if we were to do those changes would not occur. So I'll show you examples of that in just a second. But notice at the bottom, the stem changing verbs only change from O to UE, E to IE, and E to I in the stem, which is inside the boot in the present tense. That does not apply to preterite. So each tense has its own set of rules. In the simple past tense, when we just learned last chapter, we treat every verb as a regular verb until we figure out that there's something different about it. Dormirse, we'll learn later that in this chapter that it will be a basement verb. It will change on the bottom two forms. But here in this example, in the yo form, you can see what changes. If we take the verb dormirse and we conjugate it in the present tense, it actually has the same reflexive pronouns. But in the present tense, you'll see in green, it has a UE change in the stem, and then the present tense ending of an O for the yo form. And then in the preterite or past tense, it has the yo form, again, has the yo form reflexive pronoun, but then it does not have the UE change because preterite doesn't follow those stem changing rules. It will have a different kind of change that we'll discuss later. Reflexive verbs can also be I to Y verbs, but that would only apply in the preterite. If we were to do this verb, caerse, in the present tense, it would just be a yo change go verb. So the point of this is to make sure that we understand that present tense has one set of rules and preterite has a different. Here's an example of a couple of verbs already conjugated in the present tense. For example, the first one, ellos se sientan, has an IE change in the present tense, but if you look at the written answer, if we were to conjugate that in the preterite tense, we would have to undo the stem change and then just add the preterite ending. But notice that the reflexive pronoun stays the same no matter which tense you're conjugating in. So for this chapter, we're going to focus on stem changing verbs, and those are only going to apply to the present tense. We also call them boot or shoe verbs because that is the shape in which they will change. And very, very important to remember, this is only applies to present tense verbs, what we're about to talk about. So we've known since Spanish 1 that there are three types of verbs. They're AR, ER, and IR verbs, and those are the endings. When we have to actually conjugate the verbs, then we take the AR, ER, IR off and add the ending for present tense or preterite or whichever conjugation you're trying to do. Now, for regular verbs, they all follow the same pattern, which is great. That won't always be the case. So some of the differences of the verbs we're going to talk about in this chapter is that they're going to be stem-changing verbs. They're still going to get the normal AR, ER, IR conjugations at the end of the verb, but something in the stem, in the beginning, will change in all the forms, the yo form, the tu form, the el, eo, usted form, and the ellos, ellas, ustedes form. The subject pronoun that's missing from this list is the nosotros form because that one is the one that will stay out of the boot. So we continue using our same endings in the present tense, but the differences will be that for stem changing verbs, we're going to make all the stem changes in all the forms, but not in the nosotros form, and that's why we call it a boot. So if you think about This saying might help you remember that if it's in the boot, change the root, and think about a flower, and the stem of the flower, the root of the flower, is the beginning part, what holds it up, and then we attach the ending to make it for different subjects. The top part of the flower would then change. So the boot shape is what you can see here, is all the forms except for nosotros and vosotros. You don't have to worry about vosotros for our class, but for nosotros form you do have to not make the change. So change the root in the boot. If it's in the boot, change the root. The first family of stem-changing verbs that we're going to talk about are O to UE changes. We've already done the verb dormir in the reflexive section of the course, and when we did dormir, we knew that the O changed from the original infinitive form of the verb to UE inside the boot shape, which just means that nosotros and vosotros is out of the boot. Here's just another way to look at the same verb dormir with the UE changes inside the boot, and noticing that the nosotros form doesn't get the change. We'll get a more complete list of verbs that are O to UE, but if we were to have this verb with a reflexive attached to it, we would just take care of the SC at the end, put your reflexive pronouns in front of the verb if it's one verb, me, te, se, nos, and se, and then do your IR changes for present tense verbs, and then do the stem change inside the boot. So that we've done in the reflexive chapter. There's going to be more verbs that are going to be O to UE. I'll give you a more complete list in just a few minutes. But notice that the verb devolver, it has an E on it and it has an O. So these verbs are easy to tell apart because and when you're coming back from the AR, E, or IR, you're going to only look at the first vowel. Once you drop the AR, E, or IR, you work backwards, and it's the one closest to the end is what you're going to end up changing. Here's a couple more examples of some O to UE verbs, and in this case here, encontrar and recordar both have an E and an O, so when we put all the families together, you'll have to know which ones make what stem changes, and in this case, the O is closest to the AR, E, or IR, so that's what you would change in the stem part of the verb. The second family of verbs is E to IE. We did the verb querer in Spanish 1, and we knew that querer changed from E to IE inside the boot, which means the nosotros form doesn't get the change. That's a common mistake to make, is to make the change for all of them, but not all of them get it. That's why we call them boot verbs. Here's pensar, which is another E to IE verb change, and another example of how you can see those changes taking place there. There are going to be more E to IE verbs that I'm going to show you, and again, if you have a verb that has two E's, like preferir and entender, you always change the E that's closest to the end. Some more examples of some E to IE verb changes are on the screen, and notice that the verb entender, second column, second verb, means to understand, and it's a stem-changing verb. In Spanish 1, we have the verb comprender, which also means to understand, but that's a regular present tense verb. There's no changes that you need to make there. Notice that empezar and comenzar on the bottom left the empezar has two E's, so you always change the one closest to the end. Comenzar, if it has an O and an E, again, always change the one closest to the end. Last chapter we talked about preterite verbs and zada changes in the yo form to CE with an accent. That no longer applies because we're not using preterite. We're now using present tense verbs. So all the rules that we learned for past tense do not apply when we're talking about present tense verbs. The last family of stem changing verbs is E to I. An example of an E to I verb is the verb pedir. You have this in your vocab with your restaurant chapter. To ask for an order, the E will change to an I inside the boot shape. Here's just another way to look at that same verb. And E to I verbs are what we're going to focus on in this chapter. Again, if you have two E's on a verb, like repetir, always change the one closest to the end. There's going to be a lot of E to I verbs that we're going to focus on. And sometimes they'll be reflexives, and if they are, then you just put your reflexive pronouns with it, no big deal. But notice some of these verbs like reír and sonreír have an extra accent with them, If they do happen to have that extra accent, that means that accent carries over to all the rest of the conjugations on the verbs, and so you'll see them with every single conjugation in the present tense. That'll change when we start talking about these in the preterite or past tense. The verb tener we learned in Spanish 1. I call that a shoe verb instead of a boot verb because it has a change in the yo form. That's a go change. And then inside the shoe shape, if we bring that down from the ankle of the boot, so to speak, then it makes the E to IE change for those. So tengo for the yo form, something irregular to remember there, and then your E to IE changes inside the shoe instead of the boot. So shoe just reminds you to remember something different about the yo form for these verbs. If you look at the verb seguir, it has an irregular yo form. It does not have a U in the yo form, and the book doesn't give it to you in the boot shape, it just gives it to you in a column here. But just know that the verbs seguir and decir do technically also get an E to I change on those verbs. So you'll have to change the yo form of the verb to an I as well, and then, excuse me, remember that they're also go changes. So something irregular about the yo form of the verbs is why I call it a shoe verb, so that you remember that the stem then changes in the shoe, but then the yo form, there's extra something to remember. On the chart that you'll receive, you'll see where the green arrows are is where I've designated shoe verbs, and so I also put the irregular yo forms with those verbs next to it so that you know that that's what the changes take place for the yo form, and then make the changes under each column, E to IE or E to I. There are no shoe verbs for O to UE section. Also notice on the bottom right you have the verb decir as an example of a shoe verb. The yo form changes to something different. It does change the E to I, but also has a go change. Then the rest of the shoe shape there has a E to I change. At the very top of the chart, you see an example of what a boot would look like in a conjugation box. And then at the bottom of the chart, you'll see what I call a shoe verb, because it's an irregular yo form for these verbs that have something different to remember there. And then the rest inside the shoe changes in the stem. So just to recap, all these verbs follow 3 different families, or 3 different stem changes: O to UE, E to IE, and E to I. And for this chapter, we're only going to be talking about stem changing verbs. So not all verbs are going to be stem changers, but for this chapter specifically, all of them will make a change. Jugar doesn't really fit in any of those nice little 3 categories, O to UE, E to IE, and E to I. But we learned in Spanish 1 that jugar was a U to UE verb. So inside the boot, you changed the U from the original form of the verb to UE inside the boot shape. And so we're just going to go ahead and lump jugar with the rest of these verbs that are O to UE. So we're just going to kind of keep it part of that category. Again, this only applies in the present tense. So here's a couple of more examples. An O to UE, E to IE, and E to I boots. They just look a little bit different. Always don't make the change outside of the boot. But again, only in the present tense, and you can tell that these are using present tense endings. So a couple of practice here. I want, you would make the stem change to quiero, but if you were to do it for the nosotros form, you would not make the change, so it would just be queremos. She returns, the verb volver. It's an ER verb, so you're going to use an ER ending, and since it has an O in it, you're going to make an O to UE change to vuelve. We're not going to worry about vosotros, so we're going to skip that one. But to ask for, you have in your vocab is the verb pedir, so you ask for something. To form for ER verbs is ES, and then you'll have to remember, and again, I'll give you the reference chart to help you, know that pedir is an E to I change, so pides is the correct conjugation. If we were to do the same verb for the nosotros form, you would not change the E to I. It would just be pedimos. You play would be juega with a UE change, and then we don't worry about the vosotros form, although do notice that the nosotros form would not get the change because nosotros and vosotros are out of the boot. So again, stem changing verbs we call boot or shoe verbs, and that only happens in the present tense. So when we look at this chart, I want you to notice that we, excuse me, will work with the 3 different families of verbs, OUE, E to IE, and E to I. And here's a hint to help you remember which verbs go under which category. Your verbs that are O to UE will always have a O in them for you to change the verb from O to UE. E to IE and E to I is where it gets a little bit tricky because you have these 2 different verbs that make this change. Excuse me. And so if you notice the E to I column, they're all IR verbs, every single one of them. If you notice the highlighted ones in the middle that are yellow, those are the only 5 IR verbs. Divertirse, preferir, referir, sentir, and then down at the bottom, venir. Those are the only verbs that are IR verbs that are E to IE changes. So any other verb that's an AR verb that happens to have an E in it, like the first one there, cerrar, then that will be an E to IE change automatically because on the E to I column, there are no AR verbs that have an E to I change. Same thing for ER verbs. There are no ER verbs that make E to I change. All the ER verbs that have an E in them will make an E to IE change. And then your O to UE, you should know that whole entire column because if you look back from the end of the verb, whatever's closest to the end, you'll change. So if it has an E and an O or and an E, then you always know to change the one closest to the end. So process of elimination way lets you know that if you remember divertirse, preferir, referir, sentir, and venir, you're welcome to make some sort of acronym for those to help you remember a phrase to help you remember those 5 verbs. If it's not one of those 5 IR verbs, and then it will be an E to I verb for any other IR verb. So that's just a way to help you remember that out of this chart that we'll be working with, those are how you tell which verb are under which category and which stem change that they make. Please make sure you use my website. There are a lot of extra resources there for you. We will have a Quizlet link for your vocabulary for those quizzes. Remember, they won't be matching. You'll have to spell them in either Spanish or English. I do have a YouTube video playlist of a whole bunch of different things in the stem changing chapter as well for both present and preterite, which we'll cover later. Those QR codes are all over my room, so make sure you use them or put them in the home screen of your iPads on your desktop at home, or save them under your bookmarks. But notice here with the green arrow, I also give you a stem changing Quizlet link so that you remember all the meanings of every single verb on that chart. We will have a quiz over 19 of those verbs first, which will be just a vocab quiz, so you just have to know meanings, but we'll have to know meanings and conjugations for next week, so this stem changing verbs Quizlet will help you remember the meanings for all the verbs on that chart. And again, just the little saying there to remind you that if it's in the boot, change the root. And lots of additional resources there for you to use. The the website Conjuguemos also has a whole bunch of activities that you can do electronically. So here's an example of one, and I give you the link to that on my website as well. So please make sure that you use it and that you take note of all those resources that are there for you that we don't always have time to use in class. Again, to make sure that we wrap this up, we're only talking about present tense stem changing verbs for now. Later, we will talk about what happens to some of these verbs in the preterite. They're only going to change in the bottom 2 forms, so I'll call that a basement instead of a boot change, which is what happens in the present tense. We'll get back to that later in next week. So write on your chart if you need to, but if it's in the boot, change the root so that we always remember that we're talking about stem changing verbs in the present tense. In the preterite, they'll change only on the bottom 2, so that's just an example of 2 so that you can see that they're no longer going to be boot changes, they're going to be changes in the bottom 2. So you can call it the sole of the shoe, flip-flop if you'd like, or I call them basement verbs because I'll have a different graphic organizer for those when we talk about preterite. We're not ready to talk about preterite, we're only focusing on present tense. And just to remind you for the rest of this week, we're going to have our first vocabulary quiz tomorrow over the first 19 words. It will not be matching. You'll have to spell them in Spanish or English. And you have the Quizlet link on my website to help you study for those. Sometimes it helps to jot down the words a lot of times, repeatedly, so that you remember how to spell them. But I also attached to your Edmodo a spelling practice sheet that might help you as well. The second quiz is where the chart comes in. And if you want to star all those verbs, I put them in purple on the chart that I'll show you again here in just a second. But there are some verbs from the vocabulary that are not stem changers. So, for example, the verb poner, we had in Spanish one, is only irregular in the yo form pongo, then it's a regular conjugation. It's not a stem changer. We also have reservar, which is the verb to reserve, which is not anything different with it. It's just a regular conjugation, no stem changes, nothing irregular about it. So there's a combination of some verbs from the vocab and some verbs from the chart. And so those have the purple stars on them with the graphic organizer that you will get a paper copy of. And then the third vocab quiz is just vocab. We're not going to do this that we just talked about today on a quiz until next week, where you have to know meanings and conjugations of these stem-changing verbs. And again, you have a separate Quizlet for that on my website to help you study just the meanings of the verbs, not the restaurant vocabulary that we're doing this week. So this week is just vocab. The second quiz will be your 19 verb meanings, but you don't have to worry about conjugations just yet, but that's what we're going to practice next, is the conjugations. So you will have to know which verbs make what stem change by next week when we start talking about the chart. So just know that when we do that, that you'll have to be responsible for knowing which verbs are E to IE, E to I. Those two are the hard ones to remember. And then the O to UE should make sense that if it has an O, you don't automatically make a UE change. So we're only focusing on stem changing verbs for this chapter. I want you to go ahead and fill in the meanings for all these verbs and then do the practice on the back of this chart to help you with E to IE and E to I changes. For now that they're separate, but we will start joining them together, and this whole entire chart will be mixed together. You'll have to know which verbs make which changes in addition to knowing their meanings. So make sure you use the resources on my website, and if you have any questions, please let me know.